we are delighted to have Claire Griffin speaking with us today about her research on aquatic biogeochemical responses to changing cultural and climatic landscapes in the Arctic. And so my name is Rebecca Free, and I will be moderating the event along with my co-host, Lauren Thompson, and Lauren is acting as more technical support. So we are both PhD students in the CAWS lab, supervised by David Ohlfeldt at the University of Alberta. And just for housekeeping, we ask that everyone keep their mics muted for the duration of the meeting. And if it becomes unmuted, then we will act quick and mute you. At the end of the meeting, you could submit your questions via chat, and then I will moderate the questions to direct the discussion. And so sometimes it works best for the questioner to unmute and engage in the discussion a bit more once it's their turn. But again, please put your questions first in the chat, and then we can address them in the order that they come in. Just as a reminder, again, this is our final seminar of the semester, but if you missed any that you were really interested in, you can go to our website, caws.ualberta.ca, where you can watch the recordings, and also where this will be recorded and put. So exciting. And so I don't have any other announcements, so with no further ado, I'd like to take a minute to introduce our speaker. So Dr. Claire G. Griffin is a postdoctoral associate at the University of Virginia, examining how aquatic ecosystems interact with landscape changes in the Arctic caused by the twin pressures of climate change and proximate human activity. The Arctic Research Group at UVA was recently funded by the Navigating the New Arctic program to examine the natural built environment of, and I'm going to butcher this name, Utqiagvik. Claire can say it much better than I can, I'm sure, in Alaska, and work with the community to develop tools for planning, design, and environmental data exploration with the local community. Previously, she received her PhD in marine science from the University of Texas at Austin for research using remote sensing imagery to map organic matter in large Arctic rivers. Dr. Griffin is also a board member of the Earth Science Women's Network, which aspires to transform culture and institutions to advance justice, equity, inclusivity, and community. And so with that, I'll pass it on to you, Claire.
Great, thank you so much. And let me just share my screen real quick. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to speak with you all today. And sorry, I'm just getting my Zoom set up so I'm not looking at too many different things at once. Yeah, so thank you very much for having me. It's great to speak with you all. And I do have to preface every single presentation I do with, I have a very large dog who has a tendency to bark. I'm sorry if he interrupts us. He's sleeping right now. Hopefully he stays that way, but as a warning. So yeah, so today I'll be talking about two projects that I've been working on here at UVA, looking at aquatic biogeochemical responses to changing climatic and cultural landscapes in the Arctic. And these are both still in process. So I'm excited to talk to you about our initial findings and what we're hoping to work on over the next couple of years. And I'd love to get your feedback and have this be a productive discussion for all of us going forward. And so I want to start off by acknowledging that here at UVA, we are based on Monacan lands. The UVA, as you may or may not know, has a particularly fraught history as Thomas Jefferson's university with its initial mission to educate Southern white gentlemen. They have an ongoing discussion with the Monacan tribe, which is a federally recognized tribe, to partner together to try and make it a fruitful and more equitable relationship. And so if you have any questions about that, they have a resource available down here at the bottom. And all the research that I'll be talking about today takes place on Inupiaq land, near the village of Kaktovik along the Jago River, near Prudhoe Bay, and in Utqiagvik, Alaska. And so particularly with our project in Utqiagvik, we're trying to work very closely with local partners, and we appreciate their time and permissions to work on their land. So most of you are Arctic researchers, I believe, so I won't spend a ton of time on this, but it's always good to reiterate that we are interested in working on the Arctic because of, and particularly on permafrost carbon questions, because of their very high potential for long-term impacts on the Earth's climate. There's huge amounts of soil carbon stored in permafrost soils, and some of these regions are at particularly high risk of thaw over the next few decades. Where I'm working today, talking about today on the North Slope of Alaska here, has documented rapid thawing, so abrupt permafrost thaw, and is likely to continue that in the future. So it's a vulnerable place that's important to understand, both for local implications and also for the global climate system. And I'm particularly interested in water. And as you likely know, if you work in the Arctic, you can't really walk around in the Arctic in the summer without getting your feet wet. So when we think about how permafrost and how carbon dynamics are changing in the Arctic, we can't ignore the importance of water for mediating these processes. There's wetlands, there's lakes, there's streams, there's giant rivers, and all of these different parts of the aquatic ecosystem are important for mediating this carbon and biogeochemical change throughout the landscape. And when we look at that, these are localized pictures of on the ground, but when we look at that at a Pan-Arctic scale, anywhere in gray is permafrost of some sort, and anywhere that's colored is some sort of wetland or lake. And as you can see, a huge percentage of the Arctic landscape is inundated with water or has wetlands of some sort. And so when we think about what's happening in to the biogeochemistry within these waters, there's lots of different factors that are controlling the permafrost thaw and soil water interactions between the type of permafrost, how porous the soil is, how much ice is in the soil, and then lots of processes that are happening within the water bodies themselves, with consequences both for the atmospheric emissions of carbon to the atmosphere, and with in-stream ecology and processes. So even things like stratification, food webs, and that. And those type of processes can all be affected by this ultimate predecessor of how permafrost is responding to climate and interacting with the hydrology. And so that's sort of my general interests. And recently we've been thinking more and more about how not just the global implications of these permafrost water interactions, but what's happening on the ground and how that impacts people's lives. So we've all seen photos of frost heave on roads, probably. You've seen these sort of tilting houses, maybe, where the permafrost is sunk and sort of tilted the foundations. But we can see even more dramatic changes in the landscape and how they interact with infrastructure. This is on the right here. This is from a 2015 or maybe 2016, now I can't remember, sorry, event where the Saguenay-Beartalk overflowed its banks and spilled over the Dalton Highway in northern Alaska near Prudhoe, and washed out large portions of the road. This is from the same event near Prudhoe. You can see the massive degradation of ice wedges and permafrost in amongst these polygons from this big flooding event. And that has, this is a central region for oil and gas development. There's not a ton of people who live here permanently, but you can imagine something like that happening in a place where more people live. And it's still important for the oil and gas infrastructure when you have these massive road washouts. This photo here in the middle at the top is from Point Lay, where there's some of the most dramatic coastal erosion and permafrost thaw and subsidence in a town. So this is on the northern more western coast of Alaska. And you can see where the foundations underneath this building have just washed away. And I didn't include a ton of photos here of Point Lay, but there's underneath all these buildings that are up on piers, you can just see these massive pools of water that are a good indication. It's a good illustration of not just that the permafrost is thawing, but that water in and of itself has a huge responsibility or portion of why these things are changing. The heat from the water and the erosion capabilities of it. And so this is from a paper from a couple years ago where they mapped all the regions where infrastructure in permafrost regions were at high risk of hazard. And they did this based on where permafrost was, some assessment of how vulnerable the permafrost was to change, and then the density of people and infrastructure. And so here in Western Siberia, for instance, you have large high risk, high hazard area because this is a huge region of oil and gas development at the northern tip of the West Siberian lowlands. Yakutsk and villages just north of it are high risk regions because of the vulnerability of permafrost and because there's relatively more people. And then parts of Alaska similarly have these hotspots of risk where permafrost is vulnerable or more and more people live. So where we're working on the north slope of Alaska, there's not, most of the villages are all the villages are less than 5,000 people, but there's still a relatively moderate to high risk because of the vulnerability of permafrost. And I just want to point out again, if we cross-reference this to where water is, it's not perfect, but there's quite a lot of correspondence between where there's lots of water and where there is high hazard potential. And so that's some of the background that's in my mind as we've started to get involved in this project that I'll be talking about at the end, thinking about how climate change and people and development are interacting in Ukqiagvik, Alaska. So today, I'll be talking about our two projects that we've been working on. One we've been fondly calling Polygonia, and it's basically our attempts to understand the biogeophysical interactions in a ice wedge polygon landscape and think about how they're evolving and developing and either degrading or potentially stabilizing as a consequence of climate, hydrology, vegetation, and those interactions. And then my small slice of that is specifically focused on aquatic carbon and nitrogen variations across these gradients of polygon degradation and stabilization, and how those might interact with vegetation and hydrology. And then our second project that I'll be talking about is our new Navigating the New Arctic project. It just started this January, and it's still in the run-up. There have been delays because of COVID, as many of us have experienced. But I'll talk about who's on our team, the sort of interdisciplinary approach that we're taking, and our work that's trying to look at installing a network of terrestrial and aquatic sensors to understand in a high frequency, high spatially dense way what's happening in this town that is vulnerable to change, that has plans for development over the next 25 years, and how we can contribute to making better design and planning choices and as part of that process. So let's talk about ice wedges. So if you've ever flown across northern Alaska or parts of Siberia and looked down and seen these weird polygonal shapes across the landscape, those are formed from ice wedges. And an ice wedge forms when the ground freezes during the winter. The contraction of the ground opens up a crack. And then as the summer goes on, that crack stays there and then fills up with water. It freezes in the autumn and then cracks again and splits open a little bit, the wedge, and fills it again the next summer, and so on and so forth. And so you get these layers and layers and layers of cracks filling in with water and then freezing again and expanding. And as they're expanding, they're pushing up the ground around them. So you get a dip forming in the center of the ice wedge and then a ridge forming on the sides of it. So you end up with this polygonal landscape. This is from the Coloma River. I bet a bunch of you recognize it. I know a few of you at least do. But it's a side view of some of the ice wedges in the Coloma and these Yadama soils. So that's what it looks like from the side. And so one of the things that we're concerned about with ice wedges is that they degrade, they thaw, and that changes the landscape dramatically and has consequences for both how much water is on the landscape, how much if there's abrupt permafrost thaw and collapsing of the landscape and filling in with water, the types of vegetation that are there. There's lots of interactions that could potentially happen that are still, we're still trying to constrain. On the other hand, there's actually some really interesting stabilization processes that can occur that I had no idea about before I started this project. I'm not sure if many others have heard about this, but I thought it was really exciting and kind of hopeful. So as these ice wedges degrade and thaw, they collapse, they fill in with water, as you can see here in this D1 initial degradation stage, and they get deeper and deeper ponds until you have a fairly deep pond in the middle and very little buffer zone between the water, the active layer, and the ice wedge. They're basically sitting right on top of each other. But as that water gets deeper, it starts to accumulate mosses and other types of vegetation, and it actually forms an insulating layer. And that insulating layer can help prevent the ice wedge from degrading further and start to stabilize it. And so you get thermokarst cavity ice. So underneath this insulating layer, you'll get new ice forming. You'll get the buildup of sediments in the water underneath layers of mostly mosses, but other types of vegetation too. And you start to get a rebuilding of an intermediate layer of soils or sediments between the ice wedge and the active layer, and a thickening of the ice underneath this intermediate layer. And so that as that ice wedge builds up again, it starts to heave, and you actually get a raising up of the landscape so that you no longer are filling it in with water by the end. And you get a much flatter landscape. There's a much wider gap between the sides of the polygon, and there's much less water in them at all. So what this looks like on the ground is something like this. So you have a deep, narrow crack that sometimes has a little bit of water in it in the undegraded stage. And the degraded initial stage, you have a widening of that gap between the polygons, and it starts to get a little deeper and it starts to fill in with water. And there will be more aquatic sedges in that layer. And it might be completely saturated, it might be sort of dry, it depends. When we were sampling here at Prudhoe Bay, these are all from Prudhoe Bay, there had been a rain event, so things were a little bit wetter than normal, but it gives you a good idea of what it can look like. The degraded advanced stage is what we think of as these big ponds. They can be a meter and a half deep of standing water with a thick layer of mosses or sediments underneath them, and then the ice wedge. And you can actually like dig down through the sediments a couple centimeters and actually feel the ice wedge directly sometimes. And then at this stabilization initial phase, you start to get this upheaval. You can see it's a pretty wide gap between the two sides of the polygon rims compared to the undegraded stage or even the degraded initial. There's lots more aquatic sedges and it's much shallower water as the ground has started to heat back up. And then at the stabilized advanced stage, we get these wide, pretty shallow bridges that are almost completely dry. To sample water, you have to like dig down you know, a good 5 to 10 centimeters to find saturated soil sometimes. And so that's sort of the process that occurs. And one of the things that is sort of an interesting layer on top of this is that as we go through these initial stages of degradation, you go from having undegraded ice wedges with these shallow cracks, and you have low center polygons that are filled with water. As these cracks deepen, the water goes from being in the center of the polygons to in the troughs. If the troughs are not completely degraded, then they stay wet, which is what we see in these photos here in the middle. But once they become completely connected and very deep throughout the landscape, you can get really rapid lateral export and increased drainage. And so there's another layer here of how connected are these troughs and how connected are these polygons, and how does that interact with the amount of water and how much is being drained off the landscape. And so these are really dynamic and changing landscapes. So I'm gonna switch to a different PowerPoint really quick. And so these are this is from a site near the Jago River. There are a series of aerial photos and imagery going from 1950 to 2018. And you can see how the landscape develops. It goes from very dry to having lots and lots of these interconnected polygons with lots more standing water. And then it starts to drain again. What we think is happening is as those polygons get more and more connected, it becomes easier and easier for the water to drain out laterally. It's also on a little bit of a slope, which helps with the drainage. I'm gonna play it one more time just because it's cool. And I think it's worth seeing again. So yeah, here's 1950. You can see a few little ponds, but there's not very many connected troughs. And by 1978, you start to see lots more connected troughs. 10 years later, even more. By 2000, there's lots of standing water, lots of semi-connected troughs. 2006, I think, is the year with the most standing water, and then you start to see it drain more and more away. Right. And so Tor Jorgensen is the one who's put this together. And he's initially mapped out on a grid what proportion of the landscape is in these different stages of degradation and stabilization. It differs based on whether or not you're looking at connected sites that are within a connected drainage system. But the big takeaway what we see is that undegraded has decreased from about 25% of the landscape to about 10% of the landscape in 70 years. Stabilization has increased quite significantly, or is starting to increase quite significantly, but there's still a peaking in about 2007, there was a relatively high proportion of the landscape was in this degraded initial or degraded advanced stage. And there's a similar analysis that's been done for Prudhoe Bay that's in Kim Wickland's paper from earlier this year, or last year. That date is wrong, apologies. And so we can see this process on the landscape, looking at repeat photography on the ground, and also at soil cores. So this is from some cores that Misha Konevsky has done, where in 2011, at this DA advanced site near, I think, no, this is Prudhoe. You can see that the active layer goes right down to the ice wedge. There's no intermediate layer. This is all unfrozen right above the ice wedge. And then 8 years later, we have an intermediate layer. So this is the active layer up at the top, and 10 centimeters of intermediate layer has developed. So this is frozen ground that doesn't thaw every year. Sometimes it does thaw in a particularly warm year, but it's not a consistent active layer. And so you're starting to see this development of that insulating layer. On the flip side, we can have massive degradation. So this Prudhoe Bay site was previously sampled in 2012, and you can see these 3 stabilized advanced sites. They're pretty dry. They have these wide, shallow gaps between them. And by 2019, they had pretty much completely collapsed and filled in with water. And talking with Tor Jorgensen, he's been going to these sites repeatedly for many years, and it sounds like he'd never seen this type of collapse before, which is pretty alarming. And we can see that in the boreholes of the ice wedges that Misha collected. So we have this active layer in 2011, you have an intermediate layer that's relatively thin, and then the ice wedge right on top. And in 2019, there's the active layer and then there's the ice wedge. There's none of this intermediate layer that doesn't thaw every year in between. So it's a rapidly changing landscape, and which highlights the importance of trying to understand what's going on between the vegetation, the water, and the biogeochemistry. This is not from our project, but highly relevant. And so one of the things that has previously been done at this Prudhoe Bay site is taking these repeat aerial imagery, mapping out the proportion of area that is in each different degradation stage, and then matching that to more recent measurements of CO2 flux from the landscape, and then modeling how much emissions there are based on the proportion of landscape in the different stages. And so what they found is there's a pretty direct correlation between how much of the landscape is degradation advanced, so these open ponds, versus how much CO2 is being emitted to the atmosphere. And there's a nice diagram of what's happening between the CO2 and methane fluxes, the elevation of the ground surface and the water, and then our estimate of what's happening to the vegetation at the same time. And so one thing to point out here is that this process from going from undegraded to a degraded advance is really relatively fast. It's about 10 years. And then you might be in the degraded advanced for a long time, some amount of time, it's unclear. But it can take as little as 10 years to start to get that initial stabilization where you're rebuilding that intermediate layer above the ice wedge in between the active layer. But to get fully stabilized, it takes a much longer time period. It's unclear exactly how long yet, but on the order of decades. And so if we want to restabilize those ice wedges, or that's our hope for what might happen, there's a mismatch in the time between when things start to degrade and when we reach that stabilization phase. And so I think that's an important point to understand and highlight. So when we're thinking about the interactions between the hydrology and the evolving landscape and the aquatic biogeochemistry in particular, I think there's two big questions that I'm particularly interested in. And one is the potential lateral export. So as we get these changes in hydrology, how much of the carbon that's released from the soils or nitrogen from the soil as well, how much of that could potentially be exported out of the system? We're still working on a hydrological model for this region, so that's a bit of an open question at this point, and something that we're hoping to work on in the next year or so. What I'm going to talk about today is more what's happening like right now at this moment in these ponds. And so how much organic matter is there? How much could be potentially remineralized? And I think in the future, one of the things that we'd really like to think about is exactly what proportion or how much of the nutrients and the organic matter that's in the water, in the pore waters and the surface water, is potentially available to vegetation, both aquatic vegetation and like these aquatic sedges or this algae, with the name that escapes me, apologies, and how much is could be taken up by more terrestrial vegetation as well. So one of the things we initially did is just look at how much dissolved organic carbon and dissolved organic nitrogen and the quality of that DOM based on CDOM optical characteristics is in the water based on these different degradation stages. And big takeaway here is there's not a ton of difference between them, with the exception of the ice wedges. We collected some extra ice wedge ice and then shipped it down, melted and filtered it, and did the same analyses with the ice wedge water. And there's a lot of DOC, there's a lot of DON. It's pretty refractory. It's kind of what you would expect. And there's not a ton of difference between those different degradation stages. And we sort of found the same thing when we did bioavailability BDOC experiments in bottles. We saw we got relatively low amounts of DOC loss to microbial uptake or metabolism. Relatively low percentages, between 2 and 4% for the most part. The ice wedges had a much higher DOM or BDOC loss, which is interesting. And sorry, these got out of order. The ice wedges are the only ones that were an outlier again for how much SUVA changed. So most of our samples increased in aromaticity a little bit. The ice wedges decreased in aromaticity a little bit. But overall, there wasn't a ton of significant differences between the different degradation stages, which is not what I expected at first glance, but on thinking about it more, it sort of made sense. Because what really matters here, I think, is not so much the degradation stage, but where along the aquatic terrestrial interface you are. And so when we start to think about whether or not a sample is pore water or surface water or ice wedge water as in its own category, you start to see some more interesting patterns start to fall out. You get really high correlations between DOC and DON, as we might expect. They all fall along a line, so it's kind of mostly the same stuff. But you do see this clustering based on our pore water samples, our surface water samples, and the ice wedge samples. And same with ammonium. Nitrate was basically negligible. We couldn't detect it in any of our samples. Surface water, ammonium, as you might expect, was very, very low. But we could get higher and higher concentrations in the pore water and the ice wedge water. So we start to see this clustering based on whether or not you're ice wedge or pore water. And because this is a relatively small number of samples, I didn't feel like we could quantify more precisely where along the terrestrial aquatic interface these were. But I think that's something that would be worth doing in the future and exploring further to try and come up with some metric or indice of where along that continuum we are. And so similarly, when we look at how much organic matter is lost along this continuum, we see clustering again, where we see lots more BDOC lost in the ice wedges, sort of a similar amount between the pore water and surface water. But despite there being higher concentrations of DOC in the pore water, which does mean that a higher absolute amount of BDOC was lost in our pore water samples, even if the relative amount was the same. I'll skip over the rest of these for time. And then I thought the nitrogen regeneration results from this were really interesting. And so I do want to caveat that this is something that would be great to talk with you all about. I don't have a great sense of how reliable in regeneration rates in these types of bottle experiments with the little 20 milliliter bottles are. I don't think they're representative of what's going on in the environment. I suspect there's lots of bottle effects, but I do think it's suggestive and interesting and worth exploring further. And so within regeneration, we do get a relationship between the amount of initial DOC and an increase in ammonium being produced in these experiments. And it's not a strong relationship, but we do see a negative correlation between C to N. So the lower the C to N, the higher the in regeneration. And we see a really strong correlation between the amount of DON loss and the amount of N regenerated. So it's a pretty direct one-to-one relationship there. And so these are still things that we're thinking about and trying to process. One of our goals is to start to link this to similar data that we have from vegetation. So Kelsey Kent is a PhD student in Howie Epstein's lab, who's one of the PIs on this project. And she's looking at how vegetation is uptaking nutrients, mostly in unsaturated sites. But what we'd like to do is to try and bring these two data sets together to think about where is available nitrogen going, and what proportion of available N might be subject to this lateral export question once we bring that all together. So that's the direction that we're going in that I think is really exciting to bring these two worlds of the vegetation and soil dynamics together with the aquatic biogeochemistry. And so to that end, we started putting together a conceptual model of what we think is happening in these landscapes and how these coupled biogeochemical processes or biogeophysical and chemical processes are occurring and how they're changing across the landscape. And so that includes how much terrestrial vegetation is there. We see that there's more terrestrial vegetation in degrading than in undegraded landscapes. How much lateral export of water is there, how much remineralization is happening in the soils, how much CO2 and methane might be released to the atmosphere in these different scenarios. and this is not well constrained yet, but if you have thoughts or would like to discuss, please reach out to me or to other people on our team. It would be great to get feedback on this. So switching gears a little bit, I'll wrap up by talking about our new NNA project. So this is based in Utqiagvik, Alaska, formerly known as Barrow, understanding the changing natural built landscape in an Arctic community using an integrated sensor network. And so we are a fairly large and very interdisciplinary team. Howie and I have not, both of us have talked about how we've never worked on a team quite like this in the past. So it's exciting, and it's a process to learn how to talk to each other. So we have Felipe Rosado Murillo, who's a data scientist and anthropologist. Lena Cho and Matthew Jill are in architecture and landscape design. And Caitlin Wiley is a professor of science, technology, and society. And so we all have different components of this project that we're trying to put together. And we have a couple graduate students who just started or will be starting this summer, and we'll have a postdoc next year, I believe, working with Caitlin and some architecture PhD students. And so the complete NNA team is not just us, but we have collaborators with CREL, the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory, the Cold Climate Housing Research Center, UIC, the Utqiagvik Inupiat Corporation, the tribal organization, a local housing authority, and the North Slope Borough, and a local contractor who will be working with us a lot on logistics and outreach. And so one of the goals of this project is to learn how we talk to each other and how to communicate better across our different disciplines and across these different communities, because we have a different way of speaking and understanding things than many of the people that we hope to work with. Let's get that. And then, so we have essentially 3 research components to this. One is sort of the more environmental science side. So understanding how urban system components like buildings and infrastructure interact with the surrounding air, ground, and water conditions. And then we want to use this data, this information, and our improved understanding of these interactions to do design analyses and help produce design guidelines that can guide future decision-making and management in Utqiagvik, and start to think about how those design decisions can be applied and used in useful ways in other northern towns and cities. And then a third component is to study ourselves and our collaborators in Utqiagvik. And this is what Caitlin Wiley will be doing. It's to study our research team and Utqiagvik residents, how we communicate across disciplines and cultures to produce knowledge that is useful for residents and informs science and social science. And I think that's one thing that's pretty unique about this project, is that we're studying ourselves in a rigorous way, which is a little self-referential, but an important part of improving as science seems to move in this more interdisciplinary direction. Having a framework for understanding how these interactions can occur, I think, will be really useful. So we'll be installing a network of meteorological stations across Utqiagvik. We've started doing a trial run of these in Charlottesville, just because we couldn't get up there for the pandemic, because of the pandemic. But we'll look at how the air and ground are interacting with buildings and across different gradients of distance from the coast, difference from important infrastructure, large buildings or roads, and study these different types of interactions. The aquatic sensor network is a little different. It's the terrestrial sensor network. While there's a lot of landscape level analyses that can be done. A lot of it is focused on the building level because of the architecture component. The aquatic sensor network is more focused on landscape to watershed level. So we'll be doing, we have a couple of multi-parameter sondes that will go in the sewage lagoon and a drinking water lagoon to see how those are varying. And then we'll have a ton of these water level, temperature, and conductivity sensors across gradients of development and in some ponds that have been monitored off and on since the 70s to understand how things are changing and to understand the effects of different types of infrastructure on the hydrology and some indication of whether or not water quality is changing. We're targeting four specific areas. So the lagoon, where we'll have one of our sondes along the coast road to see how coastal erosion, salt infiltration, and exposure to the coastal winds might be interacting with different parts of the built environment. And then around the airport and downtown, where there's sort of the most dense development. And then this region 3 is an interesting region. This is a hospital here in the middle that's relatively new. And going south from here, there's an area of planned development over the next 20 to 25 years. And this is also where a bunch of the IVP sites are, if anyone is familiar with that program. So there's sites that have been monitored off and on for the past, since the 70s, I believe. And so that will be interesting to see how things are different in a area that hasn't been developed yet, but potentially will be. And all of this data will be used to inform building design, infrastructure choices. One of the key things that we'll be doing is holding community workshops to think about what questions people are most interested in. That's, I think, a key part of this is we have our own ideas of what we'd like to explore, but we don't live there. We don't know exactly what people think they need. And having input from the community early on is going to be essential to designing our exact research design and framework. And that's sort of one of the things we're both most excited about and most unsure about, because it's not something that we have a ton of experience with. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. Data governance and management is a big part of this. Because we want to make sure that we're treating people's data respectfully. We don't want to, we want to make sure that, especially because this is a largely indigenous community. I think it's about 60% Inupiat. We want to be very careful about who owns the data and who has control of what's public. At the same time, making it as much available for research and for decision making as possible. And then again, this is a very collaborative effort, and we'll be studying how we're making this a collaborative effort, and hopefully making recommendations to make co-production of knowledge between different communities more sustainable and easier for all of us in the future. And one example of this, just real quick before I wrap up, is we've had a few preliminary discussions, and we had, right before the pandemic hit, we had an initial trip at the end of February in 2020 up to Utqiagvik. And one of the things that we heard over and over talking with people is like, oh, ice cellars, we're really interested in ice cellars. And when we wrote the proposal, that was not on our radar at all. But you can think about how interesting that would be for people interested in water, for people interested in soil. This is a drowned fox in a flooded ice cellar in Barrow. And so these are, some of them are decades or centuries old. They've been used to store food for many years. And they're starting to flood as water infiltrates in. You start to get frost heaving and cracks and separation from the walls, and sort of a collapse of these cellars overall. And they've actually had to close down several cellars because of these issues. And so that's something that we didn't think about, but has obvious implications for both people's utility up there, and also I think could be an interesting window into what's happening in the ground that we hadn't considered before. So I'll end there, and I want to thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions. And yeah.